For more than 60,000 years, First Nations peoples have gathered and met with each other to share stories and to talk about the big issues.
After the referendum, I have to admit I was gutted. I felt like Australia didn't have our back anymore.
Everybody's feeling a bit deflated over the last 18 months or so, but I think everybody wants to know what's next.
Get up and lead. You know the challenges of your community, but you've got strengths. You've got the power. Make it.
In 2025, this tradition continues as First Nations community members from across Queensland come together to yarn about their future. And they're here at Bandarran Marra'Gu, Gathering Strength Summit in Queensland.
I feel hopeful that we've got people who are on the same page, but we really have to work. And I think the opportunity today and tomorrow is really to have that collective view and that collective drive to get to where we want to go.
We know there's lots of worries and stress at home in our communities, and we come here today to find some answers, listen to each other, see some of the good work that's already happening, and think about some of the other things we can do as we go forward.
I'm Solua Middleton. I'm a Torres Strait Islander woman with connections to Eru, and I'm a journalist. In this film, you'll find out how First Nations leaders, changemakers and advocates are promoting and protecting human rights with a focus on self-determination.
So I want to thank the Queensland Human Rights Commission for pulling together this gathering, which is, I think, an important and historic event, and so absolutely necessary after the terrible events of the recent years, including the referendum loss, but so many others.
I wanted to ask, when you think about gathering strength, what does that mean to you?
Well, we started talking about the referendum and I think we're collectively traumatised by the outcome from the vote. And I don't care anyone says, I take that as a rejection of us.
You felt like you didn't belong to a place that you grew up in. A lot of people wouldn't be wanting to leave the house and go to work and do these things. So there's a lot of conversations like that about how do we put this grief aside and continue to work in a place where we felt we were no longer wanted.
Australians knew enough to want this change, that reform to our constitution to recognise us in a meaningful way, but they were vulnerable because they were not familiar enough with our culture and our history and our heritage, and so they were vulnerable to the fear-mongering that then ensued from the coalition and their No campaign.
So what this does, gathering strength, is pulling us together, taking control of what we got control over, and the thing we got control over is how we go about this. I'm not that interested in wanting to hear what the government wants right now. That's it. That'll come. That'll eventually come. But right now, this gathering strength is us taking our strength back, taking our power back from what happened a couple of years ago.
What we've done in the aftermath of The Voice, we all went to the boroughs and we all stuck our head in the mud. And we shouldn't have done that, because we just gave up and we gave the next generation the lens in terms of it is not worth fighting.
So what's your message to mob who might feel disillusioned after the rejection of The Voice and that dismantling of the treaty legislation?
Well, it's the purpose of why we're here today, and that's to get our voice back, and that's to take some power back. And of course, after working so long on that, my focus is going to be truth-telling. There's a concept of transitional justice around the world, and it's when societies move from oppression to liberalism, they're open democracies and all that. And the thing that makes transitional justice work is truth-telling. The move from one state, oppression, to openness, the one thing that makes it work is truth-telling. And then we move on. People understand the truth and then you move on.
The more that people join our fight for justice, the more the whole world and the whole of Australia is getting the true story and not just all this made-up story. You know, someone said, oh, get over it. And Nelson Mandela said at dinner when I was over there, he said, in my country of South Africa, we're having reconciliation with the truth. In my sister's country of Australia, they're trying to reconcile without the truth, and that will never happen.
And hopefully the whole nation becomes healed out of this. Because it's not just for us. And white people have got to heal. There's a number of non-Indigenous people want to come and tell their stories about what happened to them, what their families did. It's almost, I'm a Catholic, it's almost like confessing your sins and then you can move on. So healing is for everyone. It's not, even when we did the healing strategy, the first thing we said in it, the healing strategy's got to address everyone's healing in Queensland, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
The public and political discourse over the past 18 months has been particularly harmful. We've witnessed the emergence of a policy environment that has largely rendered us invisible, and more recently, an unapologetic and willful disregard of the rights of our children.
Where are we at in terms of protecting Indigenous human rights in Queensland?
Well, unfortunately, in recent times, we've slid right back, probably 50 years or more, back to, I think, the 70s. And, you know, I've been sort of floating around the edges of Indigenous rights for many decades, and it feels like the position of Indigenous people, particularly in Queensland, is no further advanced than what it was back in 1990.
In Queensland, of course, we're seeing an attack on Indigenous people's rights. We're seeing a willful opposition to and denial of rights in Queensland for First Nations people, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and we're seeing that specifically in sectors like child safety and out-of-home care, but also the youth justice detention space where, you know, children as young as 10 are able to be locked up for crimes that potentially they don't even have the capacity to make mature decisions about.
Children are being treated by the criminal system in the same way that our criminal system treats adults. In fact, adults in watch houses currently have more rights than children in Queensland. So that's a huge concern.
Now, even while Queensland is a human rights jurisdiction with the Human Rights Act, it's been very difficult to convince the governments of Queensland to not breach human rights. And I think the most egregious breach of human rights that we have heard about constantly here at this gathering are the breaches of the rights of children, Indigenous children and Indigenous youth in the state practices of removing them from their families and their skyrocketing rates of detention in juvenile justice.
I think it was 22,000 children in out-of-home care. And, you know, a lot of those children aren't with Aboriginal families. On top of that, they're not even with their own families. So, yeah, I do a lot of stuff with trying to advocate for that and understanding it as a tactic of genocide. This isn't a mistake that this is happening at such high numbers.
One thing that a colleague of mine had said to me was the child protection system actually works perfectly. If you design a system to remove children, then, you know, we've achieved our job. So even just thinking about that as a construct, actually, what are we actually trying to achieve? And if it's to strengthen our families, then removing children from the people that love them the most is not the way to go.
You know, 10-year-olds getting locked up and things like that are out of control. That's out of control. As far as I'm concerned, there's evidence-based approaches to all of these things, and I've got them. We've been telling governments about these evidence-based approaches for crime, criminality, young people, things like that. An easy investment to make and actually cheaper than locking up kids in prison and turning them into adult criminals later on.
We don't want more jails. We don't want 10-year-olds locked up because They're stealing cars now, they're breaking and entering. They stay for 5 years with hardened criminals in adult jails. We know what's going to happen in there. Terrible abuse, terrible rape. And those people will come out with adults with machine guns. They'll pick up machine guns. That sounds really dramatic, but all that research has been done.
The evidence around that tells us that there's approaches that need to be taken that are human rights considered. We're not taking those. And so, I'm concerned that we have decisions being made at government levels at the moment that ignore evidence, that ignore the input from Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and that ignore the human rights obligations that they've signed up to.
We talk about a therapeutic approach, and people quiz that, and I did for a long time. It's really simple for me. You work out what's going on with these children and young people, physically, mentally, emotionally, and you work at fixing that up. You don't work at fixing their behaviours, you fix up those things, those deficits we're seeing. And so the simplest example I can give you is when Don Dale, we found people who were profoundly deaf, young people. So they're being told and given orders by the youth detention officers, and they're just looking at them. And all of a sudden the youth detention officer thinks they're being willful and being smart asses, and next minute they're plonked in isolation. But they can't hear what they're being told to do. Now, wouldn't you think it's one of the easiest things to fix up? A simple hearing test when kids go in, but they don't do it. They didn't do it in Dundale. People with vision issues are the same. We've seen it time and time again in schools. This kid can't learn. Well, he can't hear, he can't see what the teacher's writing. So we got to listen to the experts on this, and we've got to follow things like therapeutic approaches.
The trouble is, nobody picks up these good pieces of work and runs with them, and the politics, local and regional politics, overrides that every time because, we use as cannon fodder for local elections and regional elections and national elections, I should say. So it's a bit disconcerting after a while when you realise that you're not the issue. You're a peripheral issue that's being used as leverage for something else.
And to Chris Foley, I'd say the tough on crime thing does not work. It is irresponsible when all of the statistics and all of the experts have said that locking up more children does not help those families or those children to get a better life, and it doesn't help the victims of crime. So you should change direction, and you should listen to Indigenous communities about how to do that.
I want to go to priorities in communities. What do you see as the most urgent priorities in First Nations communities around the country?
For myself, what I see and have experienced is disconnection to culture. We're slowly losing it, and especially in, I guess, the youth of today, with some of the influences that they have at hand. It really drives a more of a divide between culture and the new world that they're walking in. But in saying that, they're not understanding that by leaving culture behind, they're losing their identity and not being able to understand who they are as a person.
Cultural survival is really important for the sustainability of our culture, our community, our cultural learning, and because I think if you don't have that as your foundation, then it's really easy to get lost and go away thinking you don't feel you know anything, or you don't feel connected to land or sea or country. You don't feel like you have the right to be who you are.
So many young Indigenous Australians have not grown up on their country and they have not grown up in culture. And, with the burden of attending school and so on, have not had, all of the opportunities that they should have to learn about their culture. They're certainly not taught in school most of the time. And they want to close that gap, that intergenerational gap, and they are plainly asking older people in the room to share culture and to make it possible for them to know their country. So I think all of the Caring for Country programs need to be shared with the younger generations, and we need to find a way to do that.
At the end of the day, one of the things I think we take from this room is, despite all of the challenges, we're still a very determined group of people that, there's so much experience, that there's many opportunities, and part of that is shifting the narrative, because we've been here before, we'll be here again, but importantly, it's up to us to define what the future looks like on our terms, and that's why I'm really convinced that a conversation around self-governance and self-determination is the way forward for our nations and our communities, and that we don't deviate from that. We stop listening to others telling us what the priority needs to be, and we set that up for ourselves, and I think that's hopefully what some of the success of these conversations will lead us to.
So it's 2025. We still do not have a formal mechanism of engagement between Queensland's First Nations and the Queensland Government. That's just, not only is that unacceptable, it's just completely untenable.
It is no longer acceptable to any Indigenous person that the scale of the disadvantages that we face, and which worsen with each generation, continue, and the only way to close those gaps is to work with the state government, particularly because it's the state governments that have most responsibility to implement sensible, rational policies that are effective and successful.
You cannot fix social issues without talking to the people who are most impacted by those issues. And that's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families, parents that need to be engaged, and there needs to be some sort of formal mechanism to represent those voices.
We shouldn't have to argue that we've got to be involved in this decision making, because we all know when receivers of services or products are involved in the development and delivery, you end up with better products and services. That's known. And once that happens and we're taken seriously, that's when we see changes.
On the flip side, where are we making progress?
I think we've come a fair way, right? So, the fact that we even had a referendum that looked at creating a voice to Parliament and recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the National Constitution, I think tells us that we have come a long way from the days of early contact.
10 years ago, there wasn't as much education in schools. People were generally not doing acknowledgements to country or welcome to country, just those simple acts of recognition. There wasn't murals all over cities,
The successes of Indigenous youth in universities who are winning awards for their groundbreaking work in science, in health, and in many other disciplines. And I think, the progress that's being made with the completion of Year 12 studies by Indigenous children in schools, this is something to be very proud of. Queensland's doing rather well in some areas in Year 12 completions.
I mean, we're starting to see in some spaces, in child protection, for example, we're seeing higher rates of participation of families in decisions about their children. There's been some good work being done in different parts of the state by community-controlled organisations to really ensure that families are part of those discussions and those decisions, about what happens with their kids. Where we see that working well, that's where we're seeing progress.
I think the bad actors, the people that led the No campaign, for example, would want us to believe that, we're losing, that we should give up. And if you look at history, we are making progress. The numbers of our people that are now lawyers and doctors and judges and silks. We've got Tony McAvoy here, the first Indigenous silk. He's not the only one anymore, So I think in some ways it has become harder since the referendum, but at the same time, we should understand that we are making progress.
And so I agree with Tony McAvoy that the outstanding outcome of this conference has been hearing from the young people and seeing the development of a youth leadership here in Queensland. And this is vitally important for our future.
What gives you hope? And I guess what's your message for the next generation that are coming through?
I'm very optimistic. I believe there's going to be change in our community. I'm not pessimistic about it.
One of the things that's occurred during the course of this 2 days gathering is that the young people have spoken about how they need hope. And the young leaders who've stepped up here are extremely impressive. So I'm optimistic that they will change the narrative and also inject optimism into our strategies.
There's still a lot of hope out there in progression of Australia as a nation. There's still a lot of hope that for the goodness in people's hearts that is still there.
I think you've got to be optimistic, and you've got to be optimistic that there's something better out there. Now, most times I don't know what it is, but I think we're going to be better when Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are seen as integral to this country and are valued.
And finally, what's your message for Mob?
For Mob, keep fighting. Don't give up. Be louder and prouder. They might have said no to our voice in 2023, but our voice needs to just get louder and louder until they cannot ignore us.